I think we're ready. So yes, good afternoon once again, everyone. So for those who don't know me, I'm Iderlina Mateo-Babiano. I'm senior lecturer in urban planning here at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, and also currently the Assistant Dean in Diversity and Inclusion. So I would like to start and begin today's webinar by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am zooming in today. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here with us today. So I would like to show a video of the National Reconciliation Week. So please bear with me while I share my screen.
Our people have lived on country for more than 65,000 years. The reconciliation process drives us to work on the relationship between the first peoples of this continent and those who now call Australia home. At its heart, reconciliation is about what happens in the simplest of terms of where we live, where we learn, where we work, and where we socialise. This year is 20 years of Reconciliation Australia. Our communities continue to grow, to learn about Australia's past and to help improve reconciliation. Now, we as a nation need to act to become a more just and equitable Australia. We need more people speaking up, speaking the truth, asking the hard questions, seeing the hard facts. 2021 is a year for us all to take action, to play our part. Reconciliation is more than a word. Reconciliation takes action.
Yeah, so for those who have attended last Friday's session, as I have mentioned, our theme for this year is more than a word, and it encourages us to take action. So in academia, through our teaching and research, we can definitely play a role in the reconciliation journey to collectively build relationships and communities that value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, histories, cultures, and futures. So in last week's seminar, we learned and we listened to two of our colleagues, Dr. Hannah Robertson and Dr. David O'Brien, and they have shared their journey in indigenizing their subjects. So I have learned about the importance of building relationship and committing to continuing this relationship even beyond the time frame of the studio or the subjects that they've run. So it was really interesting to learn of their students in their subjects who continued to work even if they were no longer students in that particular course. So for today, we will hear from three more colleagues who have been involved in indigenizing their curriculum. We have Professor Gini Lee, Dr. Judy Bush, and Professor Alex Felsen. So I'll just introduce our three speakers for today, and then we can start with the first speaker, then to the second and third speaker. So yeah, so Gini is a landscape architect, interior designer, and pastoralist, and is also professor at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Previously, she was Elizabeth Murdoch Chair of Landscape Architecture. Gini has conducted several fieldwork studios in remote Aboriginal communities in South Australia, as well as Queensland, alongside and including Aboriginal perspectives in local studios and electives. She will discuss the process as collaborations required to support these ventures. And after Gini, we will hear from Judy, who is a lecturer in urban planning at the University of Melbourne. Judy will talk about her master level elective subject, which is urban environmental policy and planning. She will share her thoughts on building cultural competency as a lifelong endeavor, and how embedding Indigenous perspectives and Aboriginal voices in teaching and learning is critical for understanding urban environmental policy and planning. And then we have, last but not the least, Alex. He is presently the Elizabeth Murdoch Chair of Landscape Architecture at the faculty, and he is a senior certified ecologist and a registered landscape architect. So he will talk about a subject that he co-teaches with Dr. Jifa Greenaway, called Design for Country, Resilience Studio, where they, along with students, explore the large urbanized river and system running through the heart of Melbourne, Australia, known as Birrarong. So, Gini.
Hi everybody. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. I had hoped to be with you in person in Melbourne, but I did a U-turn and I'm now coming to you from Kaurna country in Adelaide. and I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Ghana region. What I'd like to talk about today is just reflecting on Indigenising the curriculum. I think it's an interesting concept that we're thinking about Indigenising the curriculum, because I guess I'd like to talk about where I've been working over a number of years, and this is just a small selection. But I'd also like to reflect upon the relationship between teaching and research, and what you can do, as much as you can do given the opportunity. And I'm a non-Aboriginal person, and so this is quite interesting, I think, for us to see what it means to work with others, and to work with our own knowledge in terms of expanding the curriculum. So just very quickly, I wanted to talk about, first of all, working in place. And as we saw on Friday, there's amazing projects that you can do by actually working with Aboriginal communities in their own place. And this is quite a quick one that we did a long time ago with Kevin O'Brien, a really well-known Murray architect. And this is called Project Island. And this was on his own island, Kariri, in the Torres Strait near Thursday Island. And I just wanted to show you quickly what this meant. It took a whole bunch of students to one of the most remote and beautiful places. And as I think we heard a little bit more on Friday, is what you do is you set up where you can, and you work how you can. This is the group of students that we had. We had absolutely to use drawing skills. We didn't have very good connections to internet, computer-based work. So this is the kind of thing that we started to do. The second thing was how to really present to the community. So what happened is that everybody did drawings, and we did a couple of huge sections across the beach and through the island. The idea was that the people wanted to understand what to do with their, planning of the island due to climate change and sea level rise, and the increasing evidence of king tides that was going, because basically they lived on the beach, but these guys were trying to move up over the beach and away from the rising sea. So this was the way that we produced on site after a couple of days, something to talk to the community about. And it was fantastic, because when the community came, they drew all over this, and they started to talk to us about what was going on in their island, because we drew to them the things that we had noticed. This came very much from Kevin O'Brien, who said, once you get here, you have to prove to us that you're not just here for, and it's a quote, not just here for an interesting cultural experience, that what was really important was that we worked really hard to try and understand the critical nature of the place. Just also then, following that, we developed a few, I guess, hints about enabling people to see what we thought about their place. And so these are a couple of posters about finding country, looking at the different areas, understanding what the critical issues were, the jetty, the inland, the sea, and the foreshore. And these what everybody found. And this is what we kind of left with them, and the connections. So it was very much this sense of actually demonstrating the relationship, not only to site, but also to these fabulous drawings that actually showed people working in site. And finally, the gathering place, which became the site for design. And I think what we were talking about last time was that the students went back well after the studio had finished, and some of the students actually continued with some working drawings to actually say, how do you make this gathering place out of the area of the water in the center of town?
Gini,
and what happened?
So, sorry to interrupt. I think your slides are not moving. Have you? Oh, yeah, so it's not moving. Could you please check it? Thanks.
Okay, now we see the foreshore.
Can you see the foreshore?
Yeah.
Yes.
Were these the ones that you couldn't see before?
That's right.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure why that happened. Okay. I'm not sure. Did you see any of these at all?
No, we didn't.
Okay, I'll just do it very quickly. Remember, this is the project. Sorry about this, I'll be quick. This is where it was. This is the workspace that we had. This was us putting together the presentation for the community. This is the actual presentation wall for the community, which we actually took back to QUT in Brisbane and placed that on the wall there as well, together with comments from the community drawn all over it. And these were the project sheets that we sent back to the community on finding country: people and land, people and sea, the jetty, which was the design project, the Foreshore, a design project, connections. And as I think I was saying, the drawings that actually showed people working in place, the gathering place, which was the design aspect of what we were doing. And that was the thing where I was just saying that people were going back to do and to finish these drawings. And they did that because of the connections that they'd made with students. And they're just beginning to do this now. And it's a very slow process. But after 10 years, it's starting to happen. The next one is working with places. So the first one, working in place, embedding yourself in place. The next one is really about a project that happened between a speculation studio at Uni Melbourne and Informal Settlements Conference in Buenos Aires. This kind of way of actually working between informal settlements and also the idea of how we would work with studio is something that I think is really, really important, that we learn between teaching and research. The speculation studio introduced people to informal settlements. A small group of students decided that they wanted to work in Alice Springs and they wanted to work in the town camps in Alice Springs. Right. We worked with Google Earth. There was no way that we were able to take the students there. So we started to look at some of the planning issues, looking at the dispersal of where people were living, the types of housing developments that they were, and then also starting to find out some of the imagery that we could about what was happening, in particular Alice Springs town camps, and a particular settlement that we thought was really important for them to study and research. This is all from Melbourne. I also would like to acknowledge the Ananu people whose place this is on. So what did we do in the studio? We looked at a broad area of emerging public space, and we looked at informality in relation to opportunity. So we gave the students a sequence of things to think about that are in some senses universal, but in many ways could be developed in specific ways for the Alice Springs Towns camps. I would also say that what was happening in the studio at the rest of the time, people were working in Buenos Aires, they were working in Cape Town, they were working in a range of places. And this is one group that wanted to work in Alice Springs. One of the things that they found from that was the importance of yards and screens, really to start to reconfigure outdoor space in town camps, starting to understand what some of the health issues were, starting to understand what it meant to want to work in groups. And this group of students produced these this particular set of conditions that they wanted to work. They looked at patterns, all sorts of patterns of development. And then they actually presented the way that they would start to think of a very simple way of starting to reconfigure public space to improve the lives of people. There's a lot that is talked about in terms of housing, but in terms of their work, they were looking at the outdoor spaces. Another one we really talked about sort of working in place, but also between place, was another speculation studio. And the thing that I would actually say about this one is that while this wasn't particularly about the Port Phillip Bay as an Aboriginal place specifically, what we started to do was started to actually add the names in. So NERM, Port Phillip Bay, the idea that there are co-related territories and connections, this relationship between the European and the Indigenous, the kinds of things that we wanted to understand about the Bay, and what the connections were. But always we would start to talk about what the naming of places were. We actually looked at the kind of mapping, that early mapping that had been done, and discussed it from an Aboriginal and a non-Aboriginal perspective, looking at the very early places to try and work out what was there before. So as I said, what it's about is, from my perspective, is being able to start to use what you can to see about how the landscape has changed and what the original landscapes were from what's available. Again, the Corio Bay is Geelong. Port Phillip Bay is Neerim. That's what we started to try and do. So then we looked again at a way of looking at how Indigenous perspectives could be put into the mapping, the representation of places, transects, ways of actually working in the bigger picture of the studio, but always ensuring that the students were able to cover or look into Aboriginal perspectives as much as they could. And again, this idea of where we did these transects, the moving across places, looking at first encounters, looking at conservation, fortification, trade and separation from both historic and contemporary perspectives, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal perspectives. So that was that particular one. What I was wanting to sort of talk about now is the third part, and I hope I've got a bit of time left. I think the idea is, if you can't be embedded in the place to work in studio, I think it's really important about being informed, getting to know, and doing as much as you can given the opportunity. This is some of the research that we've been doing, and these are the kinds of things that I start to add into lectures that I give to people about this idea of the many-layered landscape. And this is a remote area of Australia that I've been working in. And one of the things that was quite important was that we started to look at very large scale work, looking at the Aboriginal trading routes and explorer routes, starting to explain to the students that there is a coexistence between the way that we moved through Australia, that Aboriginal trading routes were used equally as much as explorer routes, and now even today. But also to start to understand how to read landscapes through stories. The Seven Sisters story is a really critically important one for Australia, and in fact, actually internationally, except it's called the Pleiades, it's called different things. But this idea that we start to understand the cosmological, the dreamtime stories that happen in places, and that we learn to name them, and that places are always understood through a range of different layers of knowledge. And then as one of the findings of that research was to talk about this idea of the storied landscape. The idea of, again, understanding how people moved due to water, what some of the tracks were, what some of the early drawings were, and now what's happening today as people continue to live and coexist in these places. So the knowing of this and talking to people in the city about this, but also understanding that people, even if it's not their area, that they start to look for these signs and symbols is really important. Nearly finished. So the other thing is being informed is also housing research that we've done. We did some work some time ago about consultation, built environment outcomes, bringing that back into studio. Any of the work that you do, start to look at consultation, engagement, communication, reciprocation, feedback, a cyclical way of understanding how to work with communities, and what the implications for practice are. So between research and practice, and then talking to students about how these kinds of things can influence the way they think about their studies. And finally, going back to the idea that the right place and the right time. This was a project that we actually did, embedded in the place, that took those principles for consultation and applied them to working in a remote community for a new type of housing. So you can see it was quite important that these things coexisted. And to finish, this is urban and landscape heritage that I used to teach. This particular picture that I would like to show is really critical. And I have shown this to many, many, many students, that reminds us that sovereignty has never been ceded. This is at the Parliament House, Canberra. It's the embassy the Aboriginal embassy, the Indigenous embassy, against the country of the settler country work. So I think imagery is terribly important, and the kinds of things that you can express to people is something that you can embed these kinds of images into all of your teaching. So I'll finish there. I'm sorry if I've gone over.
Hi, everyone. I think I'm up next, so I will share my screen. So I would like to start by acknowledging traditional owners of the land on which I'm on, the Wurundjeri people, and I also acknowledge First Nations peoples from all around the world. Shirley, thanks very much for organising this. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this, and thanks to other speakers in this series as well. So as Shirley said, I am going to talk about how I have sought to embed Aboriginal perspectives and Indigenous voices in the master's subject that I teach, which is Urban Environmental Policy and Planning. GFA Greenaway has provided guest lectures for several years in this subject, and so I very much thank GFA for his contribution and really what amounted to mentoring for me. And in my attempts here, I very much acknowledge calls for non-Aboriginal people to actually step up and be brave, to engage with foregrounding Indigenous perspectives. So what I'm presenting today, pretty quickly, is how I came to this and what I include in my subject, and then I'll finish with reflections on opportunities for the future and how I can hopefully strengthen and enlarge my approach. So I was lucky to be a postdoctoral research fellow with the Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub, based in Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. And the CALL Hub, as it's abbreviated, had an Indigenous advisory group. And this was fantastic because it challenged and pushed all of the researchers who are part of the hub to build our cultural competency and to think about how we were foregrounding Aboriginal voices in our work. While I was with CALL, I did a cultural competency course at IADV that GFA and Ruben Berg were involved in. That was an amazing, the cultural competency workshop in 2015 was absolutely amazing. The Indigenous Advisory Group really challenged us to grab any opportunity we could to learn and to build our cultural competency. And part of this was through going to talks, courses, reading reports, and so on. So, of course, as well as that, the faculty itself has provided me with a number of opportunities to really build my skills and awareness in this area. And that includes the amazing symposium that GFA curated, the Go Back to Where You Came From symposium. Also, of course, the Indigenous Cultural Design Competency course. And then last year, the symposium that I co-convened with Kathy Oak and Anna Hurliman also included a number of really important Aboriginal perspectives woven into the symposium program. So these are just some snapshots of how I've gone about trying to build my own cultural competency to then be able to embed Indigenous perspectives into the subject that I teach. So I was going to play a little bit of this recording just to actually explicitly include Aboriginal voices in this seminar. So let me just get this set up.
This place has a past, a big one, a deep one, a past filled with people and stories that stretch back millennia. Sometimes this past can feel distant and abstract. You might miss it as you gently sway into the pre-COVID armpits of a stranger aboard the number 19 tram as it rambles its way down Elizabeth. The subtle earth forms and undulations that hug either side of the street hint at what used to be there, an obscured waterway. Slip down to graves and be engulfed by the 19th century bluestone buildings, cheek to cheek and bursting with coffee and tourists. If you wander down a less appealing Sagud Lane, you're confronted with a wall of earth. The wall stretches high overhead and you're in the belly of the city. It reminds you where you are, that you are not in some concrete place of the future. It reminds you that you are somewhere ancient and enduring. This city was built on a place that was and is Woiwurrung and Boomwurrung lands and waters. It rests in a basin encompassed by wooded hills and volcanic plains. The Birrarung springs from distant ranges, bringing with it rich nutrients that nurtured the sedge and rushes. For tens of thousands of years, this place has provided for and been nourished by the people who call it home.
So thank you, Maddie. Maddie was one of the co-chairs of the Indigenous Advisory Group at CALL, and that was a short recording that she did for the Wheeler Centre. You can listen to the whole recording using that URL. So as part of the subject that I teach, Urban Environmental Policy and Planning, I dedicate week 3 to Indigenous perspectives in urban planning. And this is an overview of what I attempt to cover in the subject. As you can see, I take the nothing about us without us call. And so as a non-Aboriginal person, I attempt to foreground Aboriginal voices directly by including videos, recordings and writings by Aboriginal people throughout. So I talk about reconciliation and include links to the reconciliation website. Of course, the Uluru Statement from the heart, and there's a really great recording of Aboriginal people talking about the event itself. Recently here in Victoria, we have set up the Yurok Justice Commission, and so the process of truth-telling and treaty is very important to address. And then indeed bringing Aboriginal perspectives to how we go about urban environmental planning here in Melbourne. And so this image that you can hopefully see on the screen is Maddie Miller on the left, Ruben Berg, Mandy Nicholson and Brad Mogridge. There was a panel discussion that was held at M Pavilion as part of CALL's presentations, and that recording is actually available online. So again, that's a really fantastic way to foreground Aboriginal voices and Aboriginal perspectives on Indigenous knowledge and nature in our cities. And you can see that I ask students to watch the video as well as part of the subject content. The Yarra River Protection Act, a really important and significant act. It was the first piece of Australian legislation that is bilingual. And you can see here this really fabulous and powerful photo of elders speaking on the floor of Parliament in Wurundjeri language on the preamble of that act. So this was, Victorian Parliament, and the objective of this act was to give a voice to the Yarra. And Alex will probably be talking about this more in his presentation, because I understand that's the basis that then led to that studio. And finally, the Cities Are Indigenous People was the final report of the Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub. And the first chapter of this ebook, edited ebook, includes video presentations from each member of the Indigenous Advisory Group. And so there's this great body of video material presenting Aboriginal views of cities as Indigenous places. And so again, this provides some great resources for students to engage with, as well as being able to foreground Aboriginal voices. So that's a really quick snapshot of what I present in week 3 of the subject, Urban Environmental Policy and Planning. Obviously, providing one lecture, while that might go some distance, I also try to embed material on Indigenous perspectives throughout every week's class and discussions. And certainly this is an area where I think I could continue to do a lot more, but I also recognise that, it's really important to not just have one lecture, but to ensure that material is embedded throughout. However, having said that, I still recognise that, so just to explain this, the Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub put together this 3-category approach to conceptualising working with Indigenous peoples in research and teaching. And the 3 categories. Category 3 is simply about communicating, whereas Category 2 seeks to embed collaboration, and Category 1 seeks a co-design or indeed an Indigenous-led process. So I think in the way that I approach my teaching in the subject Urban Environmental Policy and Planning, I'm really at a Category 3 level, which is about communicating. And certainly it would be really great to be able to move towards a Category 2 of collaboration, or indeed a Category 1 of co-design. In terms of my own and our efforts to build cultural competency, I really, when Durley invited me to talk about how I had indigenised my subject, I was like, no, I am indigenising it. It is a continuing process. And I think indeed my own process of building cultural competency is a lifelong endeavour. Another reflection, I really want to reinforce the nothing about us without us. I certainly don't want to ever be in a situation where I am speaking for or on behalf of. So my efforts to find Aboriginal voices to include directly in my teaching and in my research, videos, podcasts, designs, writing. We indeed have a responsibility to find ways to foreground Aboriginal voices and perspectives. And we need to be challenged to develop and deepen our understandings. And my final slide is just to indeed foreground Indigenous voices. I follow a number of really amazing academics through Twitter. So you can see some examples there on the screen, and they've recently all posted these links, how to be a good ally, 10 ways to engage with Indigenous issues, and this really amazing compilation by Dr. Sandy O'Sullivan on 101 ways, links to Black writers and voices. Great, that's it for me. Thanks very much for the opportunity to share my work with you.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Alex Felson, and I am teaching a class this semester with Jifa Greenaway, as was mentioned, on the looking at the Birrung, the Yarra River. I'm just going to open my slides now. So yeah, my name is Alex Felson. I've been teaching this studio just this semester with Jifa and as well as Christine Wallace. And Uncle Bill from the Wurundjeri has also been engaged as a representative. And I want to preface by saying that I am, new to Australia. So I moved here in July. I'm a landscape architect and ecologist. So I worked in the past with amphibians and large-scale land development as an ecologist. Also worked as a designer professionally in New York City for 10 years, and then taught at Yale University for a decade between architecture and forestry environmental science. So my background, I think, is helpful for engaging with and developing perspectives on care for country and understanding or starting to connect with and perceive the relationship of the ecological sciences to stewardship and a role of custodians of the land. And I just want to also acknowledge the fair treatment of the traditional owners of the land, the past, present, and future for the Kulu Nation here where we're working. Our studio was really established through the Birrung Council. So they invited the several universities, Uni Melbourne, RMIT, and Monash, to participate in looking at the Birrung from a bicultural perspective, and to establish or explore the idea of the Yarra as a living entity, which is written into the Act. And this Act is quite important in terms of its role in relationship to the bridging across the council with Wurundjeri elders and others. So it's we were quite fortunate, essentially, to have been invited to participate and to explore these concepts alongside other universities. Jifa and I've made a commitment to teach this class for 3 years as a gesture to recognize the importance of building trust and establishing dialogue and growing this kind of relationship over time. And then within the studio, essentially, we structured it around a sort of three-phase approach, where we really worked to have invited guests present and discuss ways of understanding the Birrung and past projects that they've worked on. And you can see from the list that there were quite a few representatives with Indigenous from Indigenous heritage that were also sharing their perspectives. So this took a fair amount of the studio to start to think about the Birrung as a living entity, and to start to understand the not just the ecological and social and planning and land use aspects of Birrung, but also its long history and its relationship to distinct language groups, and the ways in which sort of trying to understand the Birrung as a living entity as seen through the eyes of Wurundjeri and other representatives. And so the studio took a long-term perspective on the land and thought about the relationship of the influence of humans and colonization, and tried to or sought to kind of unpack some of the assumptions and the sort of perspectives that we brought to the table. And the part of this, I think, is logistically, how do you structure a teaching and academic environment effectively to produce interesting results and to help students understand the role of design and the role of landscape architecture and architecture in influencing big ideas like this, particularly when we're working in the studio on a segment or a piece of the river, as you can see in red here. But then understanding that the Yarra is quite a complex hydrologic system that's tied in with tributaries and the port and the upland conditions, and is providing as much as 70% of the drinking water for Melbourne. So it really is a fundamental infrastructure as well as a cultural and historical aspect of Melbourne. So, from the beginning, we really sought to think about the river itself and what it is, and the geologic history, the hydrologic dynamics, the cultural heritage aspects, and then thinking more about land use practices along the river. So we kind of combined a lot of these perspectives into the studio and had the students sort of synthesize or think about these various aspects of the river through collage, to start to first through the first exercise to really think about the Birrarung as a living entity. So to start to overlay or map onto the physical space the kind of ways in which it's perceived and understood, and to use design as a tool to start to explore these concepts, recognizing that the Birrarung is quite a contested land and that there are a whole range of tensions, and that the idea of the health of the river, I think, which is something that Gini Lee, who's on this call and also has participated in the studio, which has been great, something that she mentioned, to think about healing the land and where does healing need to occur. And so the students, took that advice and thought about, or at first tried to grapple with the concept of the Birrarung. So, thinking, for example, of the Birrarung as the heart of this country, and the various connections or the various pieces of the Birrarung that are critical. And you can start to see, and it's hard to read, but the students also started to use poetry and writing and language as part of the way of exploring these concepts. As well as a kind of parallel process of starting to explore specific locations and to understand and recognize that these areas are quite complicated to negotiate as a pedestrian, and there's a lot of obstacles and challenges from a design standpoint to navigate these areas. And historically, and thinking, over a long time frame, these areas have been heavily modified over time. And so, this question of embracing indigenous thinking, embracing indigenous perspectives, given the context of, for example, the Monash Freeway, that it's been built adjacent, literally, to the river itself. How do you kind of rectify, or how do you approach that, given the challenges and the concerns, And so the students also delved into the many planning documents that exist, because part of this, the nice aspect of the Bicultural Council is that there's a practical side to it, and an investigation of planning practice and how that can how that can feed into innovative thinking around the river and its history and how it's changed over time. And so I think, with this idea of indigenizing the curriculum, I think it's essential not just to look at the historical cultural aspects, but to think about the contemporary societies and the relationships that are occurring today between community and local government and state government and housing and the river, and starting to really understand what are the options that we can work with given the constraints of what's been built and what the circumstances and ownership practices that exist. And so to kind of break down this piece of land, this part of the country that we're looking at, we used a transect approach. So each student basically took on a transect. In this cross-sectional analysis of the river to understand the riverbed and the adjacent riverbanks all the way into the uplands was something that, sorry, something that Jifa had been also using in his own work. And so it really resonated. And I think part of the success of the semester, if I can call it success, because we're still in the middle of it and we haven't had our final review yet, but what feels to me like that's been really valuable has been the dialogue with Jifa around methodologies of analysis and interpretation, and starting to look at the sectional conditions of the land and the adjacent land uses, and thinking about how to layer onto this a kind of narrative, a temporal spatial narrative that incorporates Indigenous thinking as well as colonization and the contemporary perspectives on bicultural governance. And so we also developed phasing, and sorry, this is mislabeled. This is a historical on the left. So we did phasing diagrams for each of the transect locations that students were working on, and looked at what the historic EVCs were like and how that's changed in 2020 and what opportunities there are in the future. And this, for example, looks at the Hawthorne main drain as a really heavily impacted creek bed that flows into the Yarra River. And, what would it take to reestablish that as a creek, as a functioning, healthy creek system in the future? And that idea of healing, which, builds on the comments from Gini, but also the presentation that Judy Bush gave to our class about, from her background with the Mary Creek and understanding the idea of community effort and the opportunities there can be with that kind of proactive approach to healing, was kind of a strategy that we developed as well. And I think throughout the studio, the students have struggled with and tried to work on not only design principles, but principles that resonated from an Indigenous perspective and from a design and from a landscape architecture perspective, to create more effective, to develop sort of new ideas or strategies that could be that might change the dialogue. So, for example, with the Hawthorne Creek, the notion is to develop the channel between St. James Park and the park to the right here, that to develop an easement, a flood easement, as a strategy to deal with the flooding, but then to overlay that with a cultural heritage easement, and to develop an Indigenous landscape. And through the process of developing an Indigenous landscape, to build relationships with homeowners adjacent that are managing these floodable lots. And then in the long term, to try to transition that into a buyout program that could lead to purchasing homes that are in this floodplain that are facing flood risk today. And then with a long-term plan of establishing an Aboriginal neighborhood that could also do management of the creek bed. And so students took those ideas, or the ideas also of landscape, and thought about how to remake or repurpose or structure landscape from a seasonal perspective, taking advantage of the river itself and the constraints of the planting opportunities along the river, given the build out. So being realistic, but also being sensitive to the history. So just to wrap up, I think that, again, this was the first semester that we've taught this studio, and there's been a tremendous amount of learning, I think, certainly for me, as well as for hopefully for the students. And just as some takeaways, I think, listening is never easy. And I think that there's a critical need to listen and to be, proactive in terms of not assuming, for example, that the Bureau and Council itself is the end game of that bicultural dialogue, but to directly connect with for example, Uncle Bill, which we were able to do in Burnley campus, and and others who represent not only the Wurundjeri but the Bunurong, so the understanding the contested land and thinking about how to interpret or listen and hear those issues, and then thinking about reframing, and restructuring and also deconstructing assumptions, and dealing with some of the pain and the frustration and the challenges of the history of the land and colonization. Working with time, recognizing different time frames and seasonality, working towards with respect, and building sort of a group of respectful approaches, which takes time because we're learning the languages and starting to think about how to frame and describe our agenda. I think building trust is absolutely essential, and I know that Hannah Robertson, who spoke last Friday, I believe, has really done really committed, I think, to this kind of relationship building, and and I think that's a great example of ways that we can work. And Gini just mentioned a series of examples as well that where you really illustrating this kind of idea of building trust, using language, learning about distinct language groups. I think there's an amazing relationship between landscape architecture and design with country, and the notion of country that I'm hoping that we can continue to explore. Addressing embedded racism, I think, is a challenge, and really starting to understand the custodian role or the care for country. And then, one of the things that I really liked, beside the Jifa's comment about you can't cover country over, which I think was a great comment, was the way we started the class. What students themselves talked about their history and their past and described their upbringing. And it really was, I think this is a great way that Jifa had, organized at the beginning. It kind of is not just about the Indigenous people, but what do you bring to the discussion, and what's your background, and how can you contribute to this this vision and development of this new wave of understanding and recognition of the importance of Indigenous and traditional owners, and the value that embedded knowledge and deep appreciation and deep connection to the land can bring to Australia as a whole. Okay, I'll end there.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your wonderful presentation. So I'm just trying to move. So I think we have a minute more to go. So we don't have enough time for the questions and any questions and answers. So I believe that if you directly contact the presenters, they'd be happy to provide more information about their subjects and how they went through their indigenizing the curriculum in their own courses. Okay, so I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for your contribution, for sharing very insightful presentations about working in place, working with place, healing, and decolonization of our practice. And thank you also to the audience, for everyone who have been here today to attend the webinar. Thank you for sharing your time with us. And I hope that you have taken with you some ideas and insights from our guest speakers. We hope that it will encourage you to examine deeper what indigenizing teaching and decolonizing your practice would mean to you. And so, to everyone, have a wonderful afternoon and take care. And tomorrow, I'd like to invite you to, this is for ABP staff, to share reflections on the ICDC, so Indigenous Cultural Design Competency from, so we will be hearing from ABP staff. So come join us tomorrow. Thank you. Have a good day.